Oh, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So, why am I so cold? Clothing, winter clothing. It actually affects what weapons we use and how we use them quite a lot. So, one of my favourite words, as many of my regular viewers will know, is context. That's right. But context in terms of clothing has a huge impact on weapons and certain types of weapons being effective or not so effective. A famous example which I often cite is the use of winter clothing during the Crimean War. The Crimean War was fought between 1854 and 1856, and a lot of the campaigning was carried out, unlike most campaigns which were generally carried out in summer, springtime, because that was the time you could most easily feed an army. There was a protracted conflict that happened right the way through the winter months, and of course we see this equally in Napoleon's unsuccessful invasion of Russia as well. And if we're talking about large woolen coats and perhaps layers, over a sort of outer coat, over an inner jacket, over a shirt, blah blah blah, you're actually dealing with quite a lot of layers to get through. Now, in that context, general advice is that points are more effective at getting through thick winter clothing than edges are, and I think generally speaking that's probably true. Now, if we look at the medieval or Renaissance periods, again we see people, partly due to climatic reasons, but in Northern Europe we see people wearing, and even in Southern Europe we see people wearing many layers of clothing. And in those situations, even in a civilian environment, even where we're not considering armour, we're not talking about gambesons, we're not talking about mail, we're not talking about plate, we're just talking about civilian clothes. In those situations, pointy bladed swords like Oakshott Type 15s, Type 17s, Type 18s, to an extent, it could be that the design of those blades was connected to the fact that clothing could be quite thick. And of course, some of you will say, well, yeah, but the face is uncovered, the hands are uncovered. That's definitely true. Those are vulnerable spots, and that's something also to be considered in the whole equation, is the fact that if you can target exposed areas, and I'll come back to that point in a second, if you can target exposed areas, that's a good thing. Nevertheless, if you only have a few exposed areas to aim at and the rest of the body is covered in thick clothing, that's something quite difficult to contend with. I don't think that it is coincidence that when we look at hotter regions of the world, we often see more cut-centric swords, and often we see quite curved blades as well. If we look at, for example, the 14th century, if we look at North Africa and the Middle East, we start to see sabres, forms of curved blade, essentially start to predominate. Probably they came from a mixture of Mongolian and Turkish influence coming into Persia and the Arabic-speaking countries. Initially, those countries were using straight blades, by and large, not entirely, but mostly straight blades. And curved blades seem to have come partly from Mongolian, partly from the Turkish, sort of early Turkish tribes. And in fact, we see early sabres in Eastern Europe used by people like the Avars. And it seems that they came into the Islamic world for the most part in the kind of 13th, 14th century, and so if we look at the 11th, 12th century, most Islamic swords in most of the kind of North Africa and Middle Eastern Islamic countries, most of their swords are straight. Some double-edged, some single-edged, but mostly straight. And then by the 14th century, they're mostly curved. They kept using straight swords as well. I don't think it's a coincidence. Partly cultural transference, partly the style of fighting that was being carried out. Now, not to say that there weren't people wearing forms of padded armour and other types of resistant material in war, but in civilian environments or dealing with less well-equipped soldiers, I think generally speaking, if you look at a let's say, a Mamluk infantryman from the 14th century and a French infantryman from the 14th century, for the most part, the French infantryman is going to be wearing more clothes, in more layers in war. But in a civilian situation, if we look at a civilian in the Mamluk world and a civilian in medieval France, I think the medieval person in Europe will be wearing a lot more clothing in general because it's colder, because of climate. And when we start to get curved blades that are able to deal slashing blows, I think that very often these are optimized for dealing with opponents in environments where they're less likely to be wearing heavy layers or heavy layers of clothing, or indeed in some cases heavy layers of armour, although I think they are two separate things. So, coming back to the exposed elements, another example I want to give is at the Battle of Waterloo. I'll give another similar example in a minute, but in the Battle of Waterloo, it was noted that French cuirassiers had breastplates and helmets, and therefore the cuts of the British cavalry weren't as effective as they would normally be because there were less exposed areas. But it was noticed that the faces of the French cuirassiers were exposed, and so giving cuts across the face, and in fact the arms and legs as well, was the order of the day. There was a similar example in India later on where it was found that turbans were very effective at resisting a cut from a cavalry sword, and it was noted that if you could knock the turban off, either with a hit to the side of the turban or in fact with a thrust, then you could get a good chop at the head, so to speak. But really, just to summarise, clothing, be it civilian or be it military, has a huge impact on weapons and how they're used, and that is an incredibly obvious and simple point, and I shouldn't think this should be news to any of you, but sometimes something that's so obvious bears thinking about for a little bit longer. And when we're analysing weapons and the designs of weapons, you know, when we're looking at why is a kukri that shape, why is a late medieval arming sword that shape, why is a tulwar that shape, why is a katana that shape, why is a dar that shape, consider not only the military applications but also the civilian applications, and look at what were people wearing in that area at that time, and bear in mind that what people wear at a given time, it might be in the same area, but if we look at Europe, for example, what people were wearing in 10th century Europe was very different to what they were wearing in 15th century Europe. So looking at what they're wearing and how those weapons might be used in not just military contexts but also civilian self-defense or tribal conflict kind of context as well. And you know, another example mentioning tribal is you look at some of the differences between Highland, as in Scottish Highland swords, and you look at English swords of the same period. If we look at the 16th century, for example, there's some quite noticeable differences in the blades. If we look at the claymore, the two-handed claymore that is, it tends to have a broad and very thin and flat blade, whereas two-handed swords from further south, or indeed the Scottish lowlands or down into England, tend to have more stiff and narrow and more pointy blades. So very different type of thing. Is that because of the way they were fighting? Is it because what they were wearing? Definitely there were differences in clothes between what the Highlanders were wearing and what most English people were wearing. Is it because of differences in armour levels? Probably, that's a very likely point. So all of these things come into play, and it's all about context. But clothes, and particularly winter clothing, can have a really, really big effect on weapons. And anywhere you're dealing with very cold environments, that's, if you think about it, you know, you think about Scandinavia, parts of northern Scandinavia in the winter, clearly it's really, really difficult to cut through heavy layers of clothing. And so you start to think about, how did they deal with that? You know, did they aim at unprotected parts? Did they in certain parts of the year, were swords not quite as effective as they were in the summer months, and they favoured maybe the use of spears? Maybe spears were relatively more effective in the winter because they could thrust through heavy clothing than swords were. All of this kind of thing, and so clothing is really, really important to the design of weapons and how they're used and where they're used. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.